In an age when women were told to be silent, obedient, and pious, one woman did the unthinkable. She mocked her rivals to their faces, rode into battle in armour, and turned feuds into legends. Her name was Isabel of Conches, a noblewoman so ruthless, even the monks who despised her admitted she was unforgettable. It is a world painted in steel and stone, where men dominated the battlefield and the council chamber. Yet every so often, a figure emerges who disrupts the pattern, a figure so striking, so unusual, that their presence cannot be erased. One of those figures is Isabel of Conches. She was no queen, no saint, no nun cloistered in prayer. She was the wife of a Norman baron in the turbulent years of the late 11th century. And yet, chroniclers could not resist writing about her. They remembered her wit, her daring, and her relentless tongue. They remembered that she rode to war armoured like a knight. They remembered that she delighted in quarrels rather than avoiding them. They remembered her as ruthless, a woman who did not bow to silence, but who gloried in confrontation. Isabel of Conches does not fit the mould of the submissive medieval lady. She challenges us to rethink what women could be in a time we imagine as rigidly patriarchal. She is a reminder that even in an age dominated by men, women carved out space for themselves, sometimes through patience and piety, but sometimes, as in Isabel's case, through venom, wit, and ruthlessness. This is her story. Was Isabel a heroine of independence, or a schemer who thrived on conflict? Was she an admirable example of courage, or a warning about female pride gone too far? Tonight, we will follow her life through the eyes of her contemporaries, explore the world she inhabited, and uncover the ruthlessness that made her unforgettable. To understand Isabel, we must first understand Normandy itself. The 11th century was a period of extraordinary transformation. The Normans, descendants of Viking settlers who had made peace with the French crown, had become one of the most formidable forces in Europe. They were warriors, castle builders, and ambitious lords who carried their swords as their inheritance. The ruling dukes of Normandy presided over a restless nobility. Every baron sought to carve out his own power base, and rivalries were fierce. Feuds between noble families shaped the political landscape, and vengeance was often pursued with a patience that stretched across generations. In this violent setting, noble women were supposed to embody the opposite virtues. Where their husbands and sons carried swords, wives and daughters were expected to wield piety, gentleness, and diplomacy. Noble women were guardians of the household, managers of estates, mediators in disputes. They could be powerful, but always within the limits of social expectations. The Tosny family, into which Isabel married, embodied the volatility of Norman politics. Raoul II of Tosny, her husband, was proud, quarrelsome, and ambitious. He held lands in Conches, a strategically important lordship that drew him into frequent rivalry with his neighbours, particularly the powerful House of Evreux. This was the world Isabel stepped into, a culture of violence and competition where most women sought to temper male aggression. Isabel, however, had no interest in tempering anyone. She thrived in this climate, using her wit and ruthlessness to carve out a reputation as memorable as any of the men around her. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, a monk writing in the early 12th century, described her with fascination. He called her witty, daring, and loquacious. For a monk who lived in a world that prized female silence, this was both a compliment and a criticism. Isabel could not be ignored. She was too loud, too bold, too sharp-tongued. And in Normandy, that made her both dangerous and unforgettable. One of the most vivid episodes of Isabel's life comes from her feud with Helwise, Countess of Evreux. The two women lived in neighbouring lordships. Their husbands were rivals, often clashing over territory and influence. But the conflict between Isabel and Helwise was not confined to men's swords. It spilled into the women's words. Orderic Vitalis describes their quarrels as venomous, filled with cutting insults. Isabel, in particular, excelled at mockery. She ridiculed Helwise publicly, unleashing her sharp tongue to strip away dignity. She did not whisper her criticisms in private. She hurled them in public, where the sting was greatest. For Isabel, this was not mere bickering. It was war by other means. In a culture where honor was everything, to destroy someone's reputation was to strike a mortal blow. Isabel's words could tarnish the name of her rival as effectively as her husband's knights could burn her rival's fields. The feud escalated. Raoul of Tosny, Isabel's husband, fanned by her words, clashed repeatedly with Helwise's husband, William of Evreux. Castles were raided, lands were devastated, and violence spiraled. Chroniclers suggest that Isabel was not a bystander, but an instigator, that she encouraged Raoul's aggression rather than calming it. What made Isabel's quarrel so unusual was that women of her rank were often expected to mediate disputes. They were supposed to be peacemakers, soothing tempers and preventing bloodshed. Isabel inverted this expectation. She reveled in discord. She was, as Orderic noted, loquacious, but loquacious in the most dangerous way. She wielded language like a weapon. This was ruthlessness in its purest form. The refusal to yield, the delight in confrontation, the relish in destroying an enemy's honor. Isabel made enemies, but she also made herself unforgettable. Perhaps the most startling image we have of Isabel is not her words, but her deeds. Orderic records that she sometimes rode to war dressed as a knight. Clad in armour, she joined her husband's soldiers on campaign, defying every expectation of her sex. To the medieval imagination, this was extraordinary. Women were supposed to be distant from the battlefield, not riding among men, weapons flashing around them. Yet Isabel embraced this role. She did not watch from castle walls. She entered the fray. What was the meaning of this? Some may say it was symbolic, a gesture of solidarity with her husband's cause. But even as symbol, it was shocking. A woman armoured like a man disrupted the natural order, at least in the eyes of chroniclers. Orderic's fascination reveals the scandal it created. He did not condemn her outright as sinful. Instead, he marvelled at her daring. She was, in his words, bold and fearless. But to his audience, the image of a woman in armour suggested more than bravery. It suggested ruthlessness, a willingness to cross boundaries and embrace violence without shame. Isabel's enemies surely saw her presence as a sign of her unyielding nature. She was not simply a noblewoman pulling strings behind the scenes. She was there, visible, terrifyingly so, a reminder that the Tosnys did not play by conventional rules. Her armour was not just steel, it was a declaration. When we call Isabel ruthless, what do we mean? We mean that she refused the expected role of mediator. She was not content to sit silently while men raged around her. She stoked the flames, adding fuel to conflict. We mean that she weaponized language. In a society where reputation mattered more than anything, Isabel used her tongue as a blade. To humiliate Helwise of Evreux was to wound her, to cut her down in the eyes of her peers. We mean that she embraced transgression. By riding into battle in armour, Isabel broke the boundaries of gender. Chroniclers saw this as unnatural, even monstrous. But to Isabel, it was a way of seizing power, of making herself more than a silent shadow in a violent age. Her ruthlessness was also strategic. In a world where men respected boldness, Isabel's fearlessness won her admiration as well as fear. Some may have despised her, but none could ignore her. This is what made her unforgettable. Not only that she defied norms, but that she did so with relish. Where others apologized, Isabel laughed. Where others sought peace, she sought triumph. To truly appreciate Isabel's uniqueness, we must compare her to other powerful women of her era. Matilda of Tuscany commanded armies in Italy but cloaked her authority in service to the papacy. She was celebrated as a holy warrior, fighting for God's cause. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a century later, wielded power through diplomacy, charm, and cultural patronage. Even the Empress Matilda, who contested the English throne, justified her actions through dynastic right. Isabel of Conches, however, did not soften her image. She did not wrap herself in piety or cultural refinement. She wielded mockery, wit, and aggression openly. She gloried in feuds. She rode in armour. She was remembered not as a patroness of the church or as a cultural icon, but as a virago, a woman whose behaviour was likened to that of a man. For medieval chroniclers, this was unsettling. Women like Isabel blurred the lines between acceptable and unacceptable, between admiration and condemnation. They could not be celebrated without qualification. Orderic praised Isabel's daring, but he also emphasized her loquacity, a term tinged with disapproval. She was not a model to emulate. She was a warning. But she was also fascinating, impossible to ignore. Isabel of Conches left no charters, no laws, no monuments. She was not a queen or a saint, yet she endures in memory because she refused to conform. Orderic Vitalis wrote about many women, but few as vividly as Isabel. His fascination betrays her impact. She unsettled him. She unsettled his readers. She unsettles us still. Her legacy lies in her defiance. She was not content with silence. She was not content with the shadows. She chose ruthlessness as her path to power. For her rivals, she was a scourge. For her allies, she was a partner in ambition. For her chroniclers, she was a paradox, admired for her courage, condemned for her excess, remembered because she was impossible to forget. Isabel of Conches reminds us that medieval women were not passive. They could be fierce, daring, and ruthless. They could shape conflicts, ignite feuds, and leave marks deeper than any sword. She forces us to confront our assumptions. The Middle Ages were not a simple story of submissive women and dominant men. They were complex, messy, and filled with figures like Isabel who refused to obey the script. So who was Isabel of Conches? She was a woman who mocked her enemies to their faces, who rode into battle dressed as a knight, who delighted in discord rather than feared it. She was a noblewoman who embodied the pride, aggression, and ruthlessness of her age as much as any man. But she was also more than that. She was a reminder that history is filled with individuals who disrupt expectations. She shows us that medieval women were not confined to one role. Some prayed, some mediated, some ruled, and some, like Isabel, fought with words and with actions, with mockery and with steel. Was she admirable? Was she monstrous? The answer depends on how we choose to see her. What is certain is this: Isabel of Conches was unforgettable. If you've enjoyed this journey into her life, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, do you admire Isabel's boldness, or do you think she crossed the line into ruthlessness? History, after all, is not only about kings and battles, it is about the people who defied the rules, who embraced conflict, and who left us stories too vivid to fade.